Bethlehem College and Seminary is still accepting applications for the coming academic year. For more information, visit bcsmn.edu.
All right, so as I said in the introduction, our panel today is going to be on the topic of education. We heard from Dr. Woodyard Dr. Woodyard, right, remember? Dr. Woodyard last week about, we're still excited. We haven't gotten over it yet. About paideia and the importance of that as a formation for maturity. And obviously that's a major part of our vision of education here at the college. But that education actually extends down and really is about just child rearing in general. It's about raising up children in the paideia and the instruction of the Lord, Ephesians chapter 6. And so today, I wanted us to think a little bit more about education as it pertains to kind of the K-12 years. And so I've got three friends of mine here who all have various current and former experience, wisdom, practice in the realm of education. And so this is Russ Gregg, Tammy Peters, who all of you know, and then Jed Culbertson. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves in terms of what they do now or what they've done in the past. Because what Tammy does now is hang out with Viv and Molly and Trinity, and right, that's what you do. That's part of it. That's right. That's a big part of it. So I'll let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their background and experience. And the way that I'm wanting you to listen here as we talk about this is twofold. For some of you, I'll start with all of you. For all of you, you will have children. That's not true. For all of you, many of you, you will have biological children. All of you will be involved in communities where children are present. And therefore, all of us have a role. This is why when we do baby dedications in our churches, it's the church that agrees to help raise children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. We want to help parents do that. So all of us will have a role to play in forming the next generation. Many of us will actually have biological children. We'll get married and have children, and therefore will be involved in their education. And then some of you may feel a particular call into education as a vocation, I'm going to do this as my job. I'm going to teach in a school, or I'm going to work in a school as an administrator, and that might be elementary or K-12. And so part of what I'm hoping is that you'll hear all of what we talk about today through that. It's relevant for everybody, but I'm hoping that some of you may go, yeah, I want to do that. God's stirring in me a holy ambition to do what they just talked about. So that's how I want you to listen. So let's start over here. Russ, why don't you introduce yourself and kind of what you do at Hope Academy?
Yeah, Russ Gregg. I'm the founder and head of Hope Academy, just a couple blocks over here on Franklin in Chicago. And 24 years ago, on a Sunday morning, I was sitting right over here where John is right there. And as John was opening up Romans to us, he reminded us that those who are of the faith of Abraham will, as God's children, inherit the new heavens and the new earth forever and ever. And he went on and on to talk about what that meant. And at the end of the message, he said something really provocative. He said, if it's really true that for ages and ages we're going to inherit all that belongs to God, he said, for this little 70 years of vapor that you've got on the planet, you ought to venture something for God that's a little bit crazy. That was the word he used. And I almost jumped out of the pew because I had a dream for years of starting a great God-centered classical school for the children of the Phillips neighborhood. And I was so convinced at that moment that God was calling me to do that after the worst night of the sleepless night, the next day, the Monday, I walked into my boss's office and I quit my job. And my boss said, you're going to do what? I said, I'm going to start a Christian school for the children of the Phillips neighborhood. And he said, you're going to do that? He said, you don't have a building or teachers, parents, you don't have even a promise of financial support. I said, I don't. I said, all I've got is this sense that God is asking me to try and to do this. And that was 24 years ago. We started Hope in fall of 2000 with 3 teachers and 35 kids, and today we're serving 600 inner city youth with a great classical, Christ-centered education, K to 12.
That's wonderful. I mean, so when we lived in Phillips, one of the things I remember when I moved here in 2005, you'd walk around and you would see these signs in everybody's yard. I don't know, maybe there's still signs like that everywhere. For Hope Academy, a remarkable, God-centered education. And it was a really beautiful thing, because it was like, yeah, that's us. That's a Bethlehem, remarkable, God-centered education. That's what we're here for.
You know, there's one other phrase that goes with it. It says, affordable for everyone. So that was the thing, because in almost all cases around the country, this kind of education is not available to the poor. And so, yeah, affordable for everybody.
It's good. Good. Tammy, why don't you tell us a little about your background?
Can you hear me? All right. After that, I'm thinking, wow, mine has more of a down earth. I had gone to the University of Wisconsin and got my education degree. I just loved teaching. I loved learning. And so therefore, that's what I kind of pursued. It was not I hate to say there wasn't a lot of thought, but as God continued to craft the future, I ended up going on for my master's and ended up teaching at the college level. Then we ended up having children. And I was happy just to stay at home. And I didn't have a conviction, I hate to say, I didn't really have a conviction of the public school down the street. We were in a little small town, sent them down, and it was around 2000s, a little bit before. It was my sister who had gotten involved with classical education down in Cincinnati, and we were living in Milwaukee. And she said, she just was badgering me, and I was busy having babies. I really didn't think twice about this. It hadn't really been washed over my thinking at all. So then, probably it was 1999 actually, or 97, 98, long time ago. That's when my sister's prompting, get to know classical education. So I went to the national convention, the ACCS convention, and I was floored. I actually with a friend, I cried on the floor because I felt overwhelmed. I had never heard of classical education. I felt robbed. I felt cheated in my life. I'd never heard of these things and how God-word in a covenantal community, you can raise your children. I kind of always under the aspect of you do your thing, school does their thing, they grow up. Not realizing, no, my job was this, and the school comes alongside us as we raise our children. So I wasn't going to ever start a school. I didn't hear that calling. But I thought, and I never really was planning on even homeschooling. But by God's grace, I ended up, we decided there was no classical school nearby, we were going to homeschool. So we homeschooled for 2 years. And then after that, again, it was a God thing. I was up in Milwaukee, bringing up before the Lord. We wanted to put our children in a classical school. There wasn't any nearby. My sister was down in Cincinnati. We thought, well, we'll just go down and visit. If it's where we're to be, then God will make it clear. If not, then we'll go wherever. So to make a long story short, we went there, and God just absolutely made it, just enveloped us. The children were enveloped. We knew. Now, if you would have seen where Mars Hill was at that time, it was the basement of a little Baptist church on the outskirts of Cincinnati. And yet we felt, no, this is where we're called. So my husband had a great job up in Milwaukee, but he ended up looking for one, and it was to make, again, 6 months of waiting to hear. Finally, when it happened, he got a job offer. We put our house on the market. We looked for a house. We went through 2 housing inspections, all within 1 week. We knew we were to go down. So fast forwarded, our kids went to Mars Hill, and then from that point, I ended up joining the staff. And from that point, once our youngest graduated and went off to Hillsdale, I ended up writing on the national level a grammar curriculum. That'd be another question there, but at Mars Hill Academy, I ended up, as I was teaching on the staff, I ended up writing the grammar curriculum using a grammarian of the 1800s. And from that aspect, did it for our school. Then at meeting up with a professor from Hillsdale College, we ended up going ahead, bringing it to the national level. And that's what I've been doing for the last several years. I'm an author now of a grammar curriculum. Never anticipated it. I just wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. I never thought twice, and God took a hold of our family and had a different direction for us.
So you taught as an English teacher.
I taught in the,
What age groups?
yes, I'm so sorry. I did teach at the younger grades. I've taught younger, middle, and all the way up to the college level. But at Mars Hill, I was a third grade teacher.
Third grade teacher.
And I taught anywhere from second grade to sixth grade grammar within that time.
Okay, and then out of your teaching then emerges this well-ordered language curriculum idea, which then now is we use it at the you're gonna meet Jed, but Jed's the headmaster where my kids go, and so my kids used Tammy's curriculum when they were in third grade, fourth grade, things like that. Yeah. And so you've got the curriculum, and now you do trainings where you're training other teachers how to teach grammar in this method, right?
That's it.
Okay. So layers and layers of teaching
layers,
all the
and I
way
never
down.
anticipate. This is where you don't know what God has in store for you.
Yeah.
You may have a heart to go ahead, and you think you're doing this, and God will go ahead and open doors, and you're finding yourself doing things you never anticipate, like sitting here today.
That's right.
That's it.
Good. Jed, why don't you introduce yourself and what you do?
Well, what Tammy just described is exactly my story. I'm firstborn in my family, but atypical, close to zero ambition growing up. So you all are way ahead of where I was thinking, what am I going to do with my life? But I can look back now and see how God was preparing me. I was precocious and clever. I had that going for me. It was a blessing and a curse. But I tutored for a couple years with Princeton Review, teaching kids how to game the system, how to work the test to get better scholarships and things. But never saw how God's hand was moving in that. Well, we had, my wife and I had gone on this journey of discovering these new truths of doctrine and theology. And our oldest, who's now 15, he was about 3 at the time, and we had just heard about classical Christian education and saw the fruit of it. We saw the students that were graduating from such an education, and we thought, well, this is what we want to provide for our children. We lived in Shakopee at the time, Southwest Metro. There wasn't one around. You had to go downtown or to the northeast side. And so we figured we either have to move to where there are more of these, which is in the South, there are more of them, or we homeschool classically, or we start one. Well, if we start one, we can maybe bless other families. So how hard could it be? Thankfully, the Lord didn't let us know all of what that would entail at the outset, but one foot in front of the other. I was one of the founding board members, and we had a gentleman that we had hired to be the head of school starting out. But we ended up being our numbers lower than we anticipated, and so he was going to have to teach more than he thought, and so he pulled out. And the board had a secret meeting away from me and made a decision and came to me and said, hey, would you fill in temporarily until we can figure this thing out? And 10 years later, I'm still temporarily filling in as the headmaster. And the Lord has provided all along the way. So I was working at a church when we started, and they graciously allowed me to continue on there. So 3 years I worked full-time at the church and part-time at the school. And then for another 3 years, we flipped it. So I did full-time at the school and 3 years at the church. And that helped that transition of the school growing to where they could support me, supporting my family. And it's just been a joy to see students that started with us. Now, one of them is graduating this year. And taking the long view of there are challenges, kids go through seasons, and yet God is faithful to his promises, and being able to see that day in and day out is very gratifying and a blessing to me.
Good. One of the things I hear in all 3 of the stories is sort of at some point the Lord, whether it was sitting here, although it sounds like the idea of it had germinated before, it just took John to kind of that was the moment that catalyzed it. You're at the conference. You and Sarah had found some stuff on classical education. What was it about education in particular? You can talk about the particulars of classical if there's something distinctive there, but I'm thinking even more broadly of just education. What was it about that idea that made you say, I really want to give my life to that thing? Like this isn't just a Tammy, you said it kind of, I just thought, we're parent, and you send the kids down, and then they just grow up, and it's just kind of that. But all of you have kind of moved away from that sort of thinking of it just sort of happens to, man, we need to build something, we got to be intentional, this is something that you give your life to. What was it about education that really kind of grabbed you as, I want to give my life to that? You want to give us a sense of that?
Before starting Hope, we, my wife Phyllis and I moved into the neighborhood. And so with the idea of incarnation, right? When you think about ministry, I highly recommend an incarnational approach, because what happens is that when you move into a neighborhood, then your neighbor's problems become your problems in a way that doesn't otherwise happen, does it? And so I was amazed, I was shocked to discover I knew about the poverty, I knew about the crime and the violence. What I didn't know was the educational crisis going on in our inner city neighborhoods. I just assumed that in Minnesota, everybody is getting at least a mediocre education. And what I discovered is that my Black and Latino and Native neighbors were getting one of the worst educations in the whole country. That Minnesota led the country in the size of the achievement gap between whites and students of color. And so that less than half of my neighbors were going to graduate from high school, and the ones that did graduate would only be able to read at an eighth grade level. And it was coming to live in the midst of that understanding then that gripped me to say, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? It's a provocative question, isn't it? As yourself. Right? It means, we concluded that it meant that all of the advantages and all the opportunities, all the great God-centered education that we wanted for our own children, right, we should want for Jabari and for Jose. And so that meant to do something about it. And let me just say one other thing is that we moved into the neighborhood to want to bring the gospel to our neighbors here in Phillips. And I would bet that in those first 8 years that I was living in the neighborhood, I could count the number of authentic conversations about Jesus with my neighbors on one hand before starting Hope. Do you know, today I have that many conversations before lunch every day. I had no idea how powerful a school would be in connecting me to my neighbors because it meant loving them, caring about something that was important to them, and being able to bring the kingdom to a neighborhood by starting a school, of all things.
That's great. Tammy, what was it that kind of grabbed you about education? I mean, obviously you had gone to college to pursue education, but then something shifted there in terms of like, I've got to do this in a different way.
Yeah, I think I grew up in a family of educators.
Okay.
So it was a family kind of a thing. I just felt like a natural connection. I think there was one side of going, yes, I think there's that fascination of having a family line, and that just seemed like a narrative that was already going through in our family. But the other side, I'm a learner, and that quest for learning kind of prompted it. So again, why I became a reading specialist, why I pursued a reading master's, was because I wanted to understand the text. I always thought it's so fascinating how God's word is living, and those little squiggles on a page, you can read it, and the impact that God can use things like letters and words and phrases that can touch a soul has been just still mystifying to me. I still find that fascinating. And as reading specialists, how do we learn to read? How do we learn to write? How does that all happen, that God uses it in that way? So that quest was running through it, that desire, that wanting to learn more. I think that's it. And I think the most gratifying thing is to watch, I mean, for me as a teacher, is to teach. I mean, there is just something that just is so much fun. My husband used to say, he goes, well, when the kids were at Mars Hill at school, I would be teaching as well. So I would go off to teach. I wouldn't go off to work. I never went to work. I always went to teach because there is such a beautiful difference. I played. I had so much fun teaching that it was more of playtime to me than anything else. So there was that aspect of an outlet for his good. So.
Right. We always joke around here about the fact that all of our professors here teach for free, and then they pay us to grade, because the teaching is the fun part. The grading is not always the fun part. Jed, what was it for you in terms of what grabbed you about the calling of education, or the idea of devoting your life to teaching sort of next generation, whether your own kids, and then, and like you said, like same deal. I want other people to have this, not just me.
Right. I think it goes back to what you heard last week about paideia. When I was awakened to that concept and realized that what I was being called to as a father for my own children was a faithful education, not a let's just throw things at the wall and see what sticks and leave it up to them. I don't have a problem with, I love words as well and thinking through them and connotations, and a lot of words get a bad rap, like indoctrination. Ooh, scary. But there are some things I want to indoctrinate my students with. I want them all to come away with the understanding that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And we're not going to reason through that. We can, but I want them to believe that to their core as a foundation. And so the more that I saw this was going to be difficult in many other educational offerings out there, and by God's grace, I have something to bring to the table in writing a chapter in where the Lord has us. And again, not knowing what the long-term journey would be, but we can be faithful in this next step. It was initially planning on the board, and then what about being part-time headmaster? Okay, I think I can add that on, and just trusting the Lord for each new step that he calls in that, because it wouldn't have been the way I wrote my own story, but trusting in the way that God wrote it.
Yeah, right. So you didn't set out to be the headmaster. You didn't set out to start the thing. I want to start a school, but it was sort of I want to be involved in starting a school, and then the Lord had the plans to put on there. Maybe let's get a little more granular about the particular joys and challenges of kind of different age groups. I think that'd be a good kind of just paint a picture. So Tammy, you've taught kind of, and those elementary grades a lot. So talk to us a little bit about what do you love? What do you think the challenges are? If you were trying to say, present a picture to students who are thinking maybe about the future in that way, that age group of kind of the K to 6, K to 5 kind of range, what's wonderful about that, and maybe what's hard?
There's just a delight of an awe. It is anything they see and do and hear, they can be, they get so excited about. I guess the aspect I'm formulating, you can bring in any information there and they want to hear it. It's you bring them along, you show them the picture. The joy of teaching that grade, I think, is literally they're willing to go there with you. Okay, you're not dealing with other things. You're just the joy of learning, the joy of introducing them to whether it's historical, Hannibal, and telling them about the journey over the Alps and get all excited about that, or even the excitement of figuring out what a participle is and get so excited about how that can bring meaning to a sentence. And students at that age are willing to be excited too. It doesn't take much to get them excited. And maybe that's more like what I'm like.
Yeah, right. Well, and that's, I think, part of what I think my sort of rough and ready definition of a teacher is someone who loves to tell other people about the things that fascinate them, right? Like, so how do you know if you're a teacher? Do you love to tell people about the things that fascinate you? Do you just, I love this and I want you to love it too, and so I can't stop doing it. And I think, and that age group, really, for someone who loves to tell other people about things that fascinate and spread the joy, that age group is willing to just kind of jump in there with you and go, look at that.
It is. And it's really funny because, again, in the years of teaching, there was one year I taught 6th grade and absolutely loved it because they would go there with me and we were there, whatever the case might be. But I didn't have to remind them to take out a piece of paper. I didn't have to remind them about anything. They basically, I came in, we started, and off we went. Well, the next year I got to do 3rd grade. And it was a joy, but I can't begin to tell you how I longed as I watched the 6th graders go past the room going, I miss you, because 3rd grade, in the beginning of the year, they're really 2nd graders. They're little puppies. They come in and they're like all excited and they're quivering around and you're saying, please be seated and get them down, and they just write your name on your paper. Now, you may all take for granted of this, and maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure what the classes are like. But you know those little holes on your side of your paper? They go on the left side? That actually is paper orientation. You need to learn this. You know how many papers they're flipped over? The holes are on the opposite side, and they're putting their names different. Just simple things you take for granted you learned at one point. The younger grades, that's when they learn it, right? That's as a teacher. So I think the hardship is learning you have to take a lesson and bring it down to a level of the frame of the child. And you thought you were going to be teaching this, but you end up really talking about how to do a neat and petite job of your penmanship and how that brings glory to God. And that may end up being the highlight of your lesson.
Right, so there's that kind of having to accommodate to that frame. That's a great way to put it. And there's a patience that has to come with that, right? So, and I think that can often be a hard thing for teachers in general, is to go, I really want to talk about sort of the ideas that fascinate me. And at that younger grade, you're really kind of laying a foundation so that someday they can have those conversations, and you really have to have a delight in helping them to be able to do that, right? Jed, maybe talk a little bit about kind of that middle school, high school age, which I know is where you've taught, at least in recent years. What are some of the joys and challenges that you find with that older cohort?
Yeah, maybe I'll kind of bridge the gap from Tammy. And being the headmaster, I get to see a whole range of students. And one thing I love about the younger is there's that ability to teach them, but also there's a shepherding aspect that often gets overlooked. But the blessing of being able to guide them and shepherd them. Just yesterday, I had a student, a teacher brought them in, and there was disrespect in the classroom. And getting to talk to that student who, at that younger age, the emotions are much more raw, and there's not a discretion there. And you can have discussions of what's going on in your heart, and find out that there was a tiff between two of the one and her friend, and then that came out sideways with the teacher, and to work through that so that there's a growing immaturity there. And then as they continue to grow, that moves up, and you have these discussions along the way of addressing cliques with some of the young ladies, and addressing other things with the gentlemen as they grow. So I think the shepherding side is such a blessing. And then as you're doing that in that context and bringing the academics back into it, as their intellect is developing and they're thinking more abstractly and pressing into different perspectives of seeing things, it takes a certain personality to teach in middle school, someone who understands that if they're challenging you, it's not necessarily just a rebellion or trying to cast off authority, but they're really trying to press things into the corner of their understanding. And for the teacher that thinks that way and connects with those students, there aren't many more magical things in the world when that relationship is going well, and really it exponentiates the power that those students can tap into as they move into high school and ready to bless the world.
You're not a teacher. You started a school. You're head of school. Maybe talk a little bit about that. So, we're talking about education, and everybody immediately thinks classroom, teaching, instruction. But in order to actually have a school, there's a whole array of other things that are involved in structures and staffing and all sorts of stuff, budgets and things like that is the realm of the head of school. So maybe talk a little bit about kind of what you do particularly that some people might go, I don't know that I'm really built to be a teacher, but they might hear what you do and go, oh, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's really an organizational leadership role, and some of the key parts of that are every school, every organization has a telos, doesn't it? It has an end, it has a vision and an end, and somebody has to cast that vision and then hold an organization accountable to that end, right? Another part of my role is what I call being the chief cultural architect of Hope Academy. Right? Somebody has to decide how you're going to do things based on what values, what principles, and how do you flesh that out. And so, being the chief cultural architect is a key one. For our school, most all private schools, 90% or more of the funding for those schools come from parent tuitions, and then the schools raise the other 10% from alumni and grandparents and that. At Hope Academy, we do what we call the kingdom flip. And so our parents pay 10% of the costs. And we go out and raise 90% of that. And so that's a big part of my job, is to cast a vision for what we're doing among donors, that they would come and help with that. And so this year that means raising about $7 million in scholarship support to make this available to everybody. Another thing that I've been doing is, as Hope has become a national model, I started an adjunct organization called the Spreading Hope Network, and in the last 5 years, have been involved in helping to start 14 other Hope Academy type schools in cities all over the country, and they all need teachers, and they need somebody who's going to take that organizational leadership role.
That leads into a question I had. How do you guys see the relationship between sort of the school in relation to these two other big institutions of the family and the church, right? So those are sort of, when we think about the big institutions, you got the family, you got the church as sort of two main ones for us as Christians, and then the school kind of overlaps and does some of the same sort of things. But maybe talk a little bit about how family and church and school sort of can work together to accomplish kind of that vision of raising up children. Jed, you want to maybe start there?
Sure. So we see ourselves as a support of the family. So a school is not a biblical governmental sphere in and of itself, but as that ordinance is to the parents to educate their children, we come in and we support them in that. So we hire teachers that are experts in their subject matter to assist parents in that, not only on the academic side, but also on the cultural side. So that means we are looking at families and are they aligned with where we want to go? Because when that happens, we accomplish great things. And sometimes when there's a divergence, a big divergence of what family wants and what the school wants, well, the way we're set up, if we're supporting families, that just gets kind of challenging. And so that provides the opportunity for a lot of sweet community that doesn't happen in many other schools, where they kind of elevate themselves as the governing authority over the children and the experts. But when we're able to foster, we're this learning community together. Parents, you have the ultimate authority for your children and responsibility for your children, and we're assisting in that. And you get just a bunch of families doing that together, and it's incredible, just the blessing of community and fellowship that occurs there.
Yeah, Jiva.
Yeah, I was just going to, on your heels of that, I think that covenantal community, as a parent already, you're trying to raise your children, and you're doing it Godward. You want to do it for them to love Christ more, but when you have a community surrounding, wherever the community is, to see them loving Christ as well. Sometimes the cliche of it takes a village, but there is that aspect of growing together, knowing that it's our responsibility to raise these, but to have a school. For us, it meant everything. Mars Hill Academy was that little community that was that place of helping us raise our children and to look and seek Christ more. So it came alongside.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really, so thinking of it in terms of the assistance of the parents in raising children, and then sort of auxiliary even to the church in the kind of, Sunday school, how much can you actually do in terms of formal education in a church context versus the sort of everyday formation that happens in a community also sort of serves a church's life, or multiple churches' life, as the case may be, in doing that. And I think one of the things I know I've seen in Jed, and you've described it in terms of your own family, is the way that the sort of involvement in the school becomes a part of the family's mission, right? So like I've watched, I know I've seen Jed's kids, staying late to clean up and getting there early to set up because is dad's calling. This is my job. I'm going to work, but I'm not just going to work. I'm bringing you with. And we're going to do this together as a family. And there's a really sweet thing that can happen there for families that really engage as this is something that we do together. I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit about how school relates to kind of church's mission. Because I think that's really, in terms of part of what your heart and your ambition, holy ambition in this is an extension of mission.
Very much so. So it's really a missional vision, meaning that a lot of our families don't know the Lord yet, and that school becomes the means for them to hear the gospel. And one of the things that happens in urban school contexts is that parents are completely overlooked and neglected and deemed to be basically irrelevant in the education process. And so we've said that Hope is a school for the children of parents who are willing to be deeply engaged and involved in the education of their children. And so we go to some extraordinary lengths to build that relationship with the parents that becomes the means by which the gospel comes through. So, for instance, in October, 2 weeks ago, we take 3 days where we cancel classes and all of our teachers go out and do a home visit with all 400 families at the school. From 8 in the morning till 8 at night, they go out and visit every single family in their home to build a friendship with those parents and to engage them in the work. Twice a year, so last Saturday, we have something that we call Parent Involvement Day. And so all of our parents are required to come to school with their children for half of a day, twice a year. And so we spend the first part doing a workshop with parents, and then the second part, they get to go into the classrooms and see what remarkable God-centered education looks like, so they begin to treasure it and value it. And so so school can become a means of mission to families. And maybe the last thing is that one of the beautiful things that I'm seeing are graduates then going on and serving in churches and getting connected to churches, many of whose parents never were yet connected to the church.
Right, so you're sowing seeds there in those families, and it's interesting to hear the common thread, whether you've got a school that sort of has a more covenantal view of this is Christian families partnering together with our kids, or even the missional model where you say you don't have to necessarily be a Christian to send your kids here, but you do have to buy in. Like, this is something, we're not replacing you, parent, as whatever. We want to help you, and that's then an opportunity for mission. And so there's so many different ways to kind of structure schools that way, with that common vision of assisting parents and the church in forming and shaping the next generation.
Yeah, if I could add, I think, you talk about the distinction between covenantal and missional. I think they're just different parts of the journey. The church's mission to go and make disciples. I've been part of short-term mission trips where you go and you kind of you spray and pray, and you have the quick decisions, and then later, did anything change? Versus a more long-term approach of, is making a disciple simply getting someone to pray a prayer, or bringing them along in knowing Christ and learning about him. And so if you're more on the front end of that journey with parents and families that don't know anything, or further along, but we're still progressing towards Christ together. I think that's what education is discipling kids to something, and we want to disciple them to Christ.
One of the beautiful things about a school versus, say, a weekly youth group, right? That if you're at a school for 13 years, there's over 14,000 hours of connection with a child. I mean, talk about a discipleship program. 14,000 hours, right? To nurture and develop and shape a disciple of Jesus.
Right. So I mean, one even practical thing, I hadn't thought about this at the front end of our conversation, but right there, I know some of you seminary guys are thinking, maybe I want to plant a church. I want to take the gospel somewhere. Like, is a part of your church planning strategy, perhaps? Like, would one element of a church planning strategy include education, precisely for that reason? Right.
We had one of these Spreading Hope schools was started by person at Crossway in Kenosha, and he was getting ready to plant one of their churches, and he heard me say that based on my experience that I might first start a school and then start the church. And he took that seriously, and this fall he started this Kenosha Christian school for the inner city poor in Kenosha as a
church planning, as a long-term
church
this isn't
planning.
just a school. We want to build a community, and that community then has multiple institutions in it. It's going to have families, and it's going to have school, and it's going to have churches, and all of that. And so, again, there's a whole picture. Maybe last thing before we're going to head to lunch here is, if you were to sort of say one thing to those who might be thinking, I'm wondering, how would you advise them to assess whether a vocation in education would be something God might call them to? What would be one kind of piece of advice if you just wanted to seed them with, hey, if you're thinking that way, if this sparks something in you, here would be a next step, a next thought, a next something for vocation. You want to start?
I'm not the one to ask from a practical standpoint. I mentioned how I got into it, and also we had a strategic planning consultant come through a couple years ago and run a personality test on me, and he said, "You're not really a headmaster. This doesn't line up." But it's where the Lord has me, and by His grace, it's going well. But I would say, dive in and learn. Go back to voices that talk about education. Read more into Augustine. Read into Milton, who talks about it. And the more that you learn about these traditional sources that are, I don't want to just bind it to classical per se, but the ones that have stood the test of time. And as you do that, and if that fire just builds and builds in your soul, that could be a good sign. Because even though my personality test doesn't light up for it, when I read through Milton's Of Education, I just, this is what I want to bring to the next generation. And so find those sources, keep pressing in, keep learning.
Timmy?
I was going to say being really prayerful. I think right now it's a really impressionable time. You're kind of seeking out, and you maybe never thought of being going into teaching, going into education. And I would invite you to, if it were me and I were sitting there, I would absolutely make sure I'd come to Russ's school and take observations, or go to Jed's. I would go and see. And there's a lot of schools here in the Twin Cities, but I would go and quest and see, is that something where I'd be? And again, do you find joy when you're sharing your homework? Okay, so you're helping someone, your roommate doesn't get something, and you're sitting there and you got so excited about the lecture, and you're like getting all excited, drawing diagram and getting them involved in it. You may want to consider education, I'm just saying.
In an inner city context where you've got children who've experienced so much trauma in their lives, we feel like one of the most important things that I'm looking for is somebody who can build an authentic relationship with inner city children. I mean, we all know the phrase, nobody cares how much you know until they first know how much you care. And so that's what I would do is I would get involved in building relationships with inner city kids. One of the things we have at Hope is every morning from 8:30 to 9:30, we have an academic support center that you could come and do some tutoring with students. And every afternoon from 4:30 to 5:30, we have an academic support center that you could come and do some tutoring with kids and find out whether that spark happens with you.
Good. Let me pray for us as we head to lunch. I hope this has been helpful. Lord, I'm grateful for these friends. I'm grateful for their efforts, the spark that you've lit in them, the calling that you've placed on their lives, and the way that you've led them in different ways to invest in education. We love education here because we do believe it's discipleship, and we want to form and shape men and women in all of the ways for maturity, for Christian mission. And so would you be on this community here, this Bethlehem community, and perhaps raise up more who want to take and expand that remarkable God-centered education, that affordable education, that covenanted community in the church with the family education for in thousands of other places. So bless us, Lord, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, you're dismissed. Enjoy your lunch.
This presentation was made possible by the generous contributors to the Serious Joy Scholarship, permitting our graduates to launch into life and ministry without a burden of student loan debt.